By 1836, they had decided they needed a government here, so they petitioned then to have a city government and be incorporated as a city. The governor signed the act on January 7th, 1837, making Toledo a city.
You must understand that Toledo actually was the result of the union of two pioneer villages, Port Lawrence, which was located at the mouth of Swan Creek. Now, you might say that Port Lawrence was, you might say, centered about the foot of today's Monroe Street at Summit Street, and then over toward Lafayette Street. Then, downriver, there was Vistula. Together, when they joined as Toledo, and Toledo was incorporated by the state of Ohio in 1837, the population was 1,000.
Toledo was a very small city, and it was pretty simple. The government was fairly simple. It was mostly volunteer police, volunteer fire. There wasn't much for the government to do. There weren't many people, there weren't many houses. It was still mostly swamp, as I believe that would have been the period right after the incorporation when they would have been grading Summit Street and building sidewalks. Some of their first action was to put in some drainage ditches and build sidewalks and see about draining that big swamp that was in the middle of the downtown and that sort of thing. So there weren't too many people here.
It still appeared like two separate communities because Summit Street was the only roadway connecting Vistula and Port Lawrence. And you had this cluster of buildings down at what would be today Cherry and Summit, and then along Summit Street toward LaGrange Street. That was Vistula. And then you had your cluster of buildings and homes at what would be the foot of Monroe Street today at the mouth of Swan Creek, and that was former Port Lawrence. Now, an interesting thing, the rivalry was such between those two early villages, and the rivalry actually carried on for a number of years. And even though those original names were forgotten, if you were from Old Port Lawrence, you were from Upper Town. And if you were from Vistula, you were from Lower Town. And those two phrases come about from their locations along the Maumee River itself, Upper Town and Lower Town.
We do have material from Wagner and from some of the other early historians that tells approximately which houses were where. Some of the people who were here apparently left diaries or letters or something telling, gee, when I got off the boat I found 4 houses along the river, and then if you went a little further there was another house. And this map apparently was drawn at the time of the centennial in 1937 to represent what it probably looked like. And from what I have read, I'm guessing that's approximately accurate.
In Toledo itself, between the original Port Lawrence and the original Vistula, the whole heart of what is today's downtown business district was a low, swampy morass which was named Mud Creek. And Mud Creek, its width was roughly from Summit Street right on across toward Michigan Street. And you had standing water much of the time in that area, and mud.
Even into the 1850s, the whole downtown turned into a quagmire. When it rained, the streets would get very wet because most of them weren't paved.
But moreover, it made Toledo a particularly unhealthy site. What people caught, of course, were varieties of malaria. They called it a number of things, swamp fever and ague and everything else, but this was an infectious disease that was around, but nobody knew that in the time. So people blamed things like the night air. Supposedly people in the summer closed down their houses to keep the swamp miasmas from drifting in. It was very difficult for to get people to come out here. The reputation spread that Toledo was a particularly unhealthy site. And as a result, promoters had to adopt the argument that we're being maligned by our urban enemies to the east, that there's no truth in this. This is a perfectly healthy, salubrious site. The fresh breezes of the lakes purify everything, of course. But it did handicap them.
And I know I was recently shown a letter written from an early resident in 1842, and he is just so miserable being here located in Toledo, and he is bemoaning the fact. He said, "I have been so sick I can scarcely hold my pen to write," and he is writing out of town begging for some job or position because he said, "I rarely had a sick day in my life until I came to this place, and I've got to leave this dreadful location." So in the early years, interestingly enough, the environment was not all that great in terms of health.
Some of the earliest things, they were trying to drain the downtown was one of the big things they were doing, and they were building sewers, which is a big operation. I think the first sewer cost $3,000, and that's a lot of money. It was just an open, at first they were open ditches, but the first sewer was just a big pipe that went from the river out, and it was mainly to drain the swamp rather than for sewers as we think of them now. It was like a storm sewer, shall we say, and it went right into the river. And when people saw how much that helped, they all began demanding sewers of their own.
So it wasn't a natural site. Toledo is kind of an artificial creation of promoters, but there is the one great advantage, the Maumee River. This is the key to explaining what happens in the early years.
This position on the lakes and on Maumee Bay was extremely important. You could come across at that point, basically from the East Coast, get on the Erie Canal, come through the state of New York, at Buffalo, get on to Lake Erie, come across Lake Erie, down to Toledo. At Toledo, you could get on to the Miami and Erie Canal, or the Wabash and Erie Canal was basically the same until you got out into Paulding County. But you could take that canal then all the way down to Cincinnati, get on the Ohio River at Cincinnati, and then take the Ohio River to the Mississippi River and go down, well, either north or south, or you could end up at the Gulf of Mexico at New Orleans. So virtually the entire eastern half of the United States is connected up by the mid-1840s with this highway system that was really water, was the canal.
And then another thing happened in 1836 that we certainly should not dismiss. That was the year the Erie and Kalamazoo Railroad began to operate. That actually was the first railroad west of the Allegheny Mountains. And so Toledo had its beginning, you see, to become a major railroad center.
Again, this is all tied into the development of a national transportation network. The Erie Canal was built in the 1820s. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad is started in 1828. And all of this represents an effort to tie into the eastern ports to build commercial centers. Again, part of the notion of the urban frontier.
As the boom progressed and Toledo began to grow, it developed quite a ways from the early period when we found a lot of log buildings, for example, built. The first warehouse in the late 1817, 1820. First warehouses were large log buildings. But with the coming of the canal in the 40s, we begin to see construction of very substantial brick and frame buildings. And we find that, particularly with the canals, people would send away to the East Coast for whatever goods they could get. So you tend to think of this as the Wild West, but it was a very civilized place in its own perspective. Window glass was very typical. Glass was shipped in, very, very fine, beautiful furniture. Carpenters were here, and people coming through with pattern books on how to design houses that were popular on the East Coast. So that I would say by 1850, you would find a very substantially built core around around Summit and Swan Creek and St. Clair and Superior both businesses and homes mixed together in that downtown section, and very many substantial brick homes by the 1850s and certainly before the Civil War, and some very, very high style, very fine architect design homes that are long since gone. Some of those homes still remain up in the area known as Vistula. There isn't anything really left that I know of from that period in the downtown. The oldest remaining building, of course, would be the Oliver House in the downtown section from 1859, which is a very substantial, I think, 4-story brick building.
I think Toledo had a population of about 5,000 in 1852. And at that time, cities with more than 20,000 people were first-class cities, and cities with less were second-class cities, and then there were villages and incorporations and townships and so on. So at that time, Toledo had to change its city administration to comply with its status and with the Ohio law. So that's when the police force and the fire department became professional. There are no pictures of early Toledo, no photographs, that is, because, of course, there wasn't photography. But we do have some very nice paintings by an artist named William Henry Mashin, and he painted a number of pictures of Toledo in the 1850s. One of his eulogists said that he was at a time when people in Toledo were intent on making money and building businesses and getting a city developed. He was trying to show them that there was some art and beauty here, and he was intent upon something entirely different.